Good day, everybody. My name is Hicham Mourad, and I'm the Director of Technical Marketing here at Morpheus Data. I'm also joined by David Estes, who is the co-founder and VP of Engineering. And so we're delighted to spend some time with you and discuss self-service around the personas of CloudOps and SecOps that Brad touched on earlier. So I really want to get into a couple of different areas here. Let me just make sure this advances. So what I want to do is really get into that more show, less tell, as Brad said. So I want to touch in on how do we establish governance and rollback access control in Morpheus. So we're going to touch on tenancies, roles, groups, policies. I also want to touch on self-service provisioning. So we'll go in and actually provision an instance, a service, if you will, and we'll go ahead and provision an application. And then lastly, I want to come in and touch on integration. So how do we make this all happen, right? So Brad, showed those different chevrons, if you will, around the circle there. How do we make that happen? So I'll be able to touch on that. And I'm not going to do it in this exact order, so I'll be kind of jumping in between some of these concepts, depending on where I am in the user interface. So let's go ahead, get started. And David, make sure I don't go too far down the rat hole on time here. So keep me honest, please, okay?
Sounds good.
Excellent. All right, so here we are. This is the Morpheus UI. And so I'm logged in and I actually have elevated rights. So there's a lot of things that I can see here in all these different menu options. But I want to, again, jump in both on the governance and the self-service piece, and I want to show in that. But looking at this here, this gives me my quick operational dashboard. I can see the number of instances that are running. I can see my instances. My instances start with HM. That's my initial based on the naming policy that's in place. I can see that we have some issues that are open. I can see there's some log errors. Yes, we do logging in here as well. And I can see that over the last 7 days, I've had one failed backup. Maybe I should go take a look. And everything is being audited here to the max. So I can see everything here. And if I want more detail around what we're doing from an auditing and security perspective, it's all here in the activity area of the UI. But let's touch on multi-tenancy, right? So we have a lot of customers that even within their own organization want to be able to provide, and build subtenants for different groups within their environments. But we also have a lot of customers who are MSPs. And MSPs, obviously, they have their own customers and they want to be able to provide tenants to each of their individual customers. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to administration and I will click on tenants. And you can see here, I have a number of different tenants. Morpheus is my master tenant that I'm in right now. But then I also have additional tenants here that are part of my list. Great. So how did these come about, right? It's really as simple as clicking on the create tenant button, providing some information here, defining a base role, if you will. So these are actually called tenant roles. So these are roles that we create that are specific to a tenant. And these roles essentially define all the privileges to the ceiling of that tenant. So most organizations, what they'll do, MSPs, for example, will have a master role, if you will, that will become the ceiling for each of their tenants. And then they will go in and define user roles to provide additional granular RBAC as part of that. And that's it. I just define and give it my currency based on the region or area I'm in, and then we're good to go. So here we are, we have our tenant. So I'm going to go in and show you the Pied Piper tenant. So I'll click on Pied Piper. And now here I can see a list of users. So I have the ability here to add local users, if you will. But what's really important is being able to tie into different identity providers. So here you can see there's a number of different identity sources that I can simply go in and add. Right, so I can go in and add these sources. It's really as easy as defining it, providing the URL and the credentials, and then assigning some roles and mapping existing roles in the environment to different groups. So for example, if I choose Active Directory, Active Directory here, you'll see I can just simply go in and choose what AD groups do I want assigned to that. Great, so now I've defined my tenant. What's that experience look like? Again, as an administrator, right, I have elevated rights here. So one of the capabilities is I have the ability to go in and impersonate an individual in one of those tenants. So here I have, Richard Hendricks, he's the system administrator for this tenant. I have Dinesh, who's actually a developer. You know what, let me go ahead and go in as Dinesh. So I'm gonna go in and actually impersonate Dinesh. Now you'll notice something that's very obvious here. First of all, the branding, right? So complete branding and white labeling for each of the tenants, you can go ahead and do that. But you also notice that his menu options are much more restricted. Right? So there's no administration, there's other menu options, there's sub-menu options that are all missing as part of this. And that's again, because we're restricting some of these part of the governance in Morpheus and the multi-tenancy here. So as Dinesh has one instance, again, he gets that full summary here, but Dinesh today wants to provision an application. So let's go ahead and show you what that experience looks like. So I'll click on provisioning. And here's my instances. So I can see the instances that are part of the group I'm in. So my manager, Richard Hendricks here, for example, has some instances in the environment. Dinesh only has one instance, but I'm gonna go ahead and click on add. Now, one thing to note here is this is a very small list for Dinesh. Again, because I've restricted what Dinesh can see from the different instances. Now, this will make a lot more sense here momentarily where I go back and show the roles and how we define each of these capabilities and provide these capabilities to the tenants as well as the individual users as well, using the different user roles. So you know what, as Dinesh, I feel like provisioning an Nginx server here. I am going to click on next, but just before I do, I just wanted to point out that these icons indicate the technology. So you can see here, this icon says that, hey, this can be provisioned as a virtual machine, or it can be provisioned as a container. This one here, my CentOS, it can be provisioned as a virtual machine, or I can provision it to bare metal. So I have the ability to provision that to bare metal as well, right? So this is a nice visual cue, if you will, in terms of, where you're going, what are the things that you can do. So Nginx, I can do this as a VM, I can do it as a container. I'm gonna click on next here. I'm only part of the development team, so we'll touch on groups in just a moment, but that's how we essentially think of groups as business groups where you bring in individuals and the different clouds together as part of that. So you have your user roles and you have the different clouds that you've actually connected to. And I'm going to show you that in a moment as well. So
can I ask a quick question?
Please.
For the previous list where you have all the different,
yes,
I don't know, let's call them runbooks for now, for the different products and the different deployment methods. Do you keep them regularly updated? Is that through a product update, or are they pointed somewhere else?
Yeah, great question. So those are all essentially pointers to different repositories. We have a repository with some of those, so we actually keep those updated on the back end for you. And as a matter of fact, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but by default, we have over 50 plus different node types of services that you have. And when I exit back as Dinesh here, the developer, you'll see when I go in to show you that I have a much longer list of all those. But yes, we do keep those updated. And you have the ability to go in and copy and customize and do everything you want to in the library, which I'll point to briefly in a moment.
Okay, thanks. And just while I've got you, just one last one. When you showed the health around the compute stats and where you collected the logs, are you talking natively to the cloud provider, or do you have an agent running on the machines?
So we have an optional agent. So some of those metrics do require the agent, but the agent is completely optional. So if you decide that, hey, you don't want the agent has a very small footprint. And it takes very little utilization on the machines, but it does allow us to capture things like logs and other performance metrics as well. But remember, again, it is optional. You can choose to select that or not.
Okay, and you can talk to some of the native services if you needed to, like CloudOps.
I'm going to touch on some of those here momentarily. And actually in the DevOps section, Adam is going to be touching in more detail around libraries and actually some of those cloud native services as well. So we'll get to that in a moment.
Okay.
I don't want to steal Adam's thunder.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So you can see here, as part of my group, you know what? I'm actually assigned 3 different clouds. I can provision to AWS. I can provision to my Nutanix private cloud. I can provision to my VMware private cloud as well. So you can see I have the different options. I can choose whatever I want. That's what I've been granted access to. I'm just going to go to my VMware cluster. You see here, there's a naming convention. It's actually grayed out. And the reason why it's grayed out is because my administrator, Richard, has put in a naming policy in place saying, hey, the naming for these is going to be like this, right? And so it's actually been decided for me. I don't have an option to do that. I can put in an environment tag. I can add just a label on this if I want to. I'm just going to click on next. And now, one of the things that you see here, there's this layout. So under this configure section, again, remember I said we can do a container, we can do a VM, right? So here's the Nginx container. And very quickly, I can see some of the plans around that. I can see the pricing, which I'm going to touch on in just a second. But let me go ahead and switch that just to a virtual machine, right? I'm more comfortable right now with virtual machines. I haven't gotten too much into Kubernetes yet. I just want a VM. And you can see here, based on the plan, I can see the actual pricing. And not only can I see the pricing, but based on the clouds that I have access to and I can provision this to, I now can see a cloud comparison around pricing. We're going to touch more on pricing and give you some more details around that later, but you can see that information here. So I can really make, good, solid decisions as I'm, doing this. Let's say I want to actually, I'm going to give it some extra memory. What the heck, right? And you can see the pricing just updated here for me, and as well the other clouds. So let's go ahead, and I only have access to a couple of resource pools here. I'm going to choose the network I want this to land on. There are some additional things I can do, like under advanced options, I can do things like add tagging as well that will follow through. So if I want vSphere tags, AWS tags, GCP tags, etc., I can go ahead and do that. I'm going to click on next. I want to spend a moment on this screen. This is really important. Why? Because when it comes to provisioning, there's a lot of things that you typically want to do from a continuous automation perspective, right? So here, for example, under automation, I can go in and tie in workflows, right? And so I can tie in things like configuration management workflows, something like an Ansible playbook or Puppet or Chef, or I can actually create some of my own workflows that could be scripts or other things that I want to be able to execute as part of this provisioning process, right? I actually maybe want to deploy some software. You know what, Pied Piper, they actually have a compression application here, so maybe they want to actually deploy that application or some other application or a database, etc. You can actually deploy that as part of this. I can add a load balancer. I can do some scaling, right? So if I want to deploy the service and I want to define a scale and a threshold, I can go ahead and do that. I can tie in things like backups, right? So if I want, Veeam or Rubrik or whatever I've been assigned to as part of this, I can tie that in. So now not only do I actually provision this, but I can also make sure that I can back this up and again, bring more security to my environment. And lastly, when it comes to lifecycle management, I'll expand that really quickly here. I can go in and define a power schedule, right? So you could have a power schedule. So here's a power schedule called Dev Team Power Schedule. These things shut down at night and come back on and during the day if I wanted that. My administrator hasn't locked me in on that, so I can actually make that change. But notice for shutdown days and expirations, I'm locked in. There's nothing I can do here. It's going to shut down after 24 hours unless I actually extend it. And it's going to expire after 2 days, and it will end up deleting shortly after that. So I'm going to click on next. I actually see a summary here. If I want to deploy multiple copies of this service, I have the ability to simply expand options and say, hey, how many copies of this do I want? And then I'm just going to go ahead and click on complete. And very quickly here, you can see that here it is. It's in my list. It's provisioning. That's what the blue indicates. It's actually in a provisioning status. And just very quickly, I will go ahead and actually show you that. So you can see here that 1, it's provisioning. And 2, remember I have that policy that's been dictated by my administrator. The instance is going to shut down in 24 hours, right? So I see that here. Great. But let me go back to instances. I've actually previously deployed some instances in the environment just to kind of be able to show you what can I do as a consumer after I actually deploy this. So very quickly, I'm going to select one of these instances that I own as Dinesh. So I can see the status. I can see the health of this machine. I can see how long it's been available. I can see performance metrics like CPU, memory, and storage. I have some additional details. Oh, but let's go down and take a look at a few more things here. But before I do, let me show you day 2 actions. okay? I want to be able, I own these resources, right? So I have the ability and I'm allowed to provision these resources. I want to be able to do things like shut it down, start it, you know, I want to be able to maybe run a workflow. I want to be able to reconfigure it, maybe add some resources, right? So there's a lot of great capabilities from a day two actions perspective. But again, we give you additional information here. I'm just going to scroll down. Here again, to Kyle's question, right? Some of that performance metrics, right? So memory, storage, CPU, so you can see some of this information here all made available for us here historically as well. Again, I can switch between any of these tabs. I'd like to highlight logs here, for example. So again, we're pulling in logs automatically for you if you have the logging capability turned on. We're pulling that information. I can go in and assign a backup and check and see when the last time this machine was backed up. I can look at the history and see, hey, when did I provision this? I actually just provisioned this last night, I believe it was. And so I can see when it was provisioned, when it was completed. And lastly, I want to be able to provide console access to my users. So here you can see that I have console access as part of this. Great. So this is that self-service experience, if you will. And again, I've completely locked Dinesh in terms of what he can see, what he can provision. It's a much smaller list. If I take a moment.
I have a question here.
Yes, please.
So you should ask the deployment of a single virtual machine. What happens if I have a complex application built out of several virtual machines that they need to be started in a sequence and things like that?
Enrico, thank you for that question. That's actually exactly where I'm headed. But also Adam is going to take us into a lot more detail around blueprints specifically and how we can go in and create these multi-cloud blueprints. But I will show you that in just a moment, and then I'll let Adam dig deeper into that, okay? So just hold that thought if you don't mind, Enrico. Thank you.
Okay. You got about 3 or 4 minutes left, Hicham, so giving you time.
Oh, really? I better go quick. Okay. So just wanted to highlight here again under administration, right? You know, we have these roles. And then when you think about roles, we have two different types of roles. There's tenant roles, as I mentioned, and then there's user roles. But I just wanted to point out here, for example, that Pied Piper role, if I go in, I can actually go in and provide access at the feature level. Every feature in the UI I can turn on and off. I can decide, hey, what clouds is this tenant going to have access to? And I can go in and be very granular in what clouds. Instance types, right? This is to Kyle's question from earlier. Hey, all these different instance types. I can go in and choose exactly which ones I want to allow a tenant to see within my environment. And lastly, blueprints. To Enrico's question, hey, you know, what about complex applications, not just a simple service, right? You know, how do we grant that access, right, through these blueprint constructs, which Adam is going to talk about here in just a little bit. So I get to define all this very granularly, right? And then I get to group all that, leveraging the groups, if you will. Now, having said that, I was going to go ahead and actually provision an application, but just very quickly, I want to show you, I actually provisioned 2 applications here. So again, very similarly, I have my own blueprint construct here. These are more complex applications with cloud native applications, which Adam is going to talk to you about. But if I, for example, just type, you know, CMS, you can see I have some CMS applications. Just like I actually provisioned those instances, it's a matter of provisioning this. And however, what does that look like at the end? I can see an app. Here's an application. This application has 1 container and 2 instances. Oh, let's click on that. I'll just show you very quickly that if I scroll down here, you can see 1 container, that's my MySQL layer, and my Tomcat layer is 2 virtual machines. It's 2 EC2 instances. This is actually running in my AWS. The first one I provisioned was VMware. This one is public cloud. But similarly, I have access to day 2 actions. I have monitoring information. I have logging information all around this. Now, because I only have very little time left, I just want to point out 2 last minute things. First of all, policies. We have a very rich set of policies within the Morpheus platform. This helps, again, with that SecOps persona, if you will. You can see all the policies here, but it's just a matter of being able to go in. So these are the different types of policies. There's like 30 of them here in this list. and I can get very granular. And what I mean by that is when I actually create a policy, obviously I get to enable it, but I get to actually assign it. I can do a global policy. I can do an individual user policy. I can assign it to a role. I can assign it to a specific cloud. So I can get very granular in how I provide this access and how I apply these policies, right? So something like that naming policy that you guys just saw when Dinesh was provisioning, he couldn't change that. That was a naming policy in here that decides that. And the last thing I just want to point out, again, because of time here, is how do we make this all happen? This all happens through integrations. So when I click on integrations, there's a ton of things I can integrate, and you can see there's different clouds and different services here. It's really just a matter of being able to integrate all these different services as part of this, okay? Very simple. And just want to highlight here. So in the groups, I want to point the demo group because that's the one we have the majority of the clouds. And Brad asked me, hey, can I show also clouds and how we add clouds? So here are all the different clouds that are in my environment. But I just wanted to point out by scrolling down to the bottom, we have the ability to tie in the largest number of both private and public clouds than any other solution out there. So you can see all the public clouds in this list here on the left, and you can see the private clouds on the right, and I'm going to scroll down so you can see the remainder of these. And by far the most common one that we see here is really VMware. And it's literally just a matter of basically me going in, giving it a name, providing the URL and the credentials, providing some options to say, hey, yes, bring in discover existing workloads for me. And then, you know what, do I want to provide things like hypervisor access to some individuals? I can go ahead and do that. And lastly, under advanced options, and this is where think back to that slide that Brad showed, that spaghetti slide. Hey, you know what? I want to be able to tie in things like firewall. I want to be able to tie in things like a trust provider. I want to tie in things like Zerto for replication. I want guidance. Give me some recommendations around these different workloads. I want to tie in my DNS environment. I want to tie in things like configuration management. And lastly, I want to tie in something like my IT service management solution in my CMDB environment. So here's ServiceNow. I want to tie that in. So bringing that self-service experience essentially and really closing that loop around the self-service experience. And I know I've gone a little bit too much over time here, so I want to hand it over to David and be respectful of his time. Any last minute questions before I switch over to David?
Yeah, quick question. So when you talk about policies, are those all defined by the platform, or do you have the ability to tie into things that are specific to maybe an individual public cloud? For example, some providers have things like guardrails for governance within that cloud that might not exist across other environments. Do you have any integrations for anything like that?
Good question. There's, and like I said, a number of policies here that we can create and customize and tailor. We do have the ability to tie those in via cloud as well. So one of the scoping capabilities was being able to tie it to a cloud. By doing so, we're also able to take advantage of some of those, essentially some of those capabilities that are native to those clouds as well. David, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, one of the problems when you start talking about hybrid cloud is if you want to do policy enforcement and you're in a hybrid cloud environment, you've got many policy engines, right? Amazon does things differently than Azure does, than Oracle does. So in that sense, we try to prefer using the independent policy engine where we apply those governance and discovery in both an active and passive way across all those clouds, including your on-prem. That's typically how we kind of approach that. That being said, if you've got existing policies in your Azure, in your Amazon, those types of public cloud environments, Morpheus will inherit those and adhere to those as well. But it doesn't directly manage those necessarily.
Follow-up question. I saw that you have a policy set up and especially in the DevOps cycle and stuff. Do you feed any of this information to any of the existing AIOps tools or APM tools? Because this could be a valuable information for them, particularly when it comes to policies, how this was deployed, when or who, and both for auditing purposes as well as if there's something is not working in a RCA root cause analysis and stuff, this could be very useful. You do any of that or have plans to?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And one of the things I think we'll get more into in DevOps side of the conversation as well is that we actually have a ton of capabilities with the API. So you can actually export any of this data to any tool you want. So that's the common way to do that. All right. Just a quick roadmap. What's next from the self-service side? I do want to kind of talk about this. Is we do have some new stuff coming in 5.0. You guys have seen a lot of the centralized platform and management UI of Morpheus, and we're adding a new concept called personas. And what this persona idea is we've run into situations where we've had certain customers who want certain isolated UIs, not just by removing things from the UI like you saw with tenancy, but you may have a user who wants to just create a basic VM. They don't care about some of the complexities or things like that. So personas is a new approach to this. We're actually starting with a self-service persona, but the idea is a dynamic UI tailored to that target audience. We plan on expanding that further as well into maybe a FinOps or a financial-based persona, or VDI maybe, or reporting, things like that in the future. So we're very excited about this, and I actually can show you some of this as well if you would like to see that. So I'm going to drive into that really fast because I know we're short on time. So Brad, keep me apprised here. So this is actually a demo or preview of the self-service persona. You can see I have several items here. This is your dashboard. You get a nice top items and inventory. But it's a little different than that at Instance Wizard. You can just go to your catalog and order something and add it to your cart. So it's very simple. So I can say, hey, I want an Apache server, so I can see it's featured. I can click the order button. I get a nice detail view of what this is and what it represents. What's cool about this is this form is completely customizable. You can build your own custom form and code that into how this provisions, which is very cool. So if you want to restrict, I want a small, medium, and large, I want some scripts that automatically pick the network, you can totally do that. So I can just give it a name, add it to a cart, and it becomes part of my cart, and then I can order that. I also get an inventory. Building these is also very easy. I can just go to switch persona here, for example, and go back to what you guys have seen throughout this demo. And I can go to tools, self-service, and this is where I can build those. I can actually, the end result of this product is you'll be able to actually create self-service catalog items for instances, for complex blueprints, and operational workflows or tasks. So we're very excited about this. You can kind of see what this looks like. You can say, hey, I want to add an instance type. I've got a few already here. So let's look at MySQL, for example. You can see what the config generated from the wizard. It lets you kind of visually build that. I need to upload a logo still. But you can also pick your option types and build that form. And that's pretty easy how to build it. And then those option types can be injected in here. So for example, this name field, it's custom options.name. I could actually replace this to the host name if I wanted to, or name right here. I could just wipe this out and do something like this. And there's a lot of cool features there, but it allows you to dynamically inject what you want to build, which is pretty cool. More on that definitely coming in the next coming weeks. We're working very hard on that and excited to show that off. Really quick, just a few other what's next with 5.0 is we've actually implemented a full plugin, external plugin framework. So you can actually write your own integrations for Morpheus now. We've had an internal one for years, and we've actually been working hard to expose that to our customers and partners. So for example, if you've got a custom IP address manager or DNS you want to use in Morpheus, you can actually code that into Morpheus and use that. Same with UI extensions. Maybe you want to add some custom tabs to your instance details or custom reports, task types, approval workflows, or even security backends. So there's a ton of cool features we're adding there. Later on in the year, we're going to take that further and do things like full-on clouds and backup integrations, things like that. So the end goal there is you'll be able to receive independent updates. Say a cloud makes a change, rather than waiting for a Morpheus release, you can actually get a push plugin update as well. So very excited about that, and we think it's going to really rapidly accelerate some of our dev cycles as well. And finally, from there, we're actually digging into compliance. So we're actually starting to add NIST CVE scanning capabilities into the product. We already discover installed packages and software on your workload. So we're going to be able to give you vulnerability scanning reports on that, and tying into OpenSCAP, things like that for SCAP scanning and reporting as well. We already also are starting to have the ability to monitor traffic. So you can look at a workload and see what other workloads that are inventoried or discovered it might be communicating with. This is going to be especially great if you're talking about discovery and trying to figure out a migration plan or something like that in the future.